long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School, for this supporters exclusive show. And for myself and Ken, it's our Constitution show. So Ken, welcome to the supporters show, where today we're going to be delving into the 13th and maybe just a teeny bit of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah, this is what I miss the most when we're not doing the show together, and that is our Constitution shows. This has been a lot of fun. And I always start off with this little bit of a disclaimer. All of our Constitution shows are available to supporters. All you have to do is head there, and you can go all the way back. There's a ton of them there. We've been having a lot of fun with this. And so what we do in each show is we begin by reading reading the portion of the Constitution that we're going to deal with, and then discussing that portion of it, the court cases that deal with it. And we got done with the general text of the U.S. Constitution, and we've moved in to, first the Bill of Rights. We've gone through the Bill of Rights, and now we're getting ready for the Reconstruction Amendment. So the amendments that dealt and came after the conclusion of the American Civil War. And the first one that we're going to take on is the 13th Amendment. And like I always do, we're going to read that. And there's two sections to the 13th Amendment, and I'm going to be reading both of them. And Section 1 says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." And then Section 2, "Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." And right there, that is the entirety of the 13th Amendment. Now, I'm not the first to say this, and we have repeatedly addressed it when it comes to the text of the Constitution. But slavery is undisputedly the original sin, or at least one of the original sins of the U.S. Constitution. And the 13th Amendment is a response to that. But unlike other portions we have covered, its significance is primarily, although not exclusively, historical. So to kind of put this in a little bit of context, right, slavery was even an issue, and we talked about this in earlier episodes, that the British threw back at us in the immediate aftermath in 1776 in our Declaration of Independence. Saying, well, all men are created. Really? The U.S. Constitution, though, as you know, it's not like the Declaration of Independence. It's trying to kind of create institutional structures. It very deftly avoids addressing the issue, save, again, as Ken and I have talked about, keeping Congress from banning the importation of enslaved persons until a certain date. So in short, our Constitution created a federal government which would uphold what would eventually be called, quote, the peculiar institution. Now, despite the normal reading of school children, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, it doesn't end up ending the institution of slavery. It only freed enslaved persons held in the 11 Confederate states that had seceded, not in border states that had remained with the federal government. It was a promise for those he thought would already lose. It wasn't for another nearly 3 years that the true abolition would be achieved in the U.S. with the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865. Now, of course, the abolition of that system of chattel slavery was the most important of the 13th Amendment's provisions. It wasn't alone. It also stops involuntary servitude. So, for example, especially in New Mexico, poor citizens, former enslaved persons were put into positions of peonage. And that's kind of working to pay off one's debt. And the Supreme Court would ultimately find that practice unconstitutional in 1911 in the case of Bailey versus Alabama. And then, of course, Ken, in Section 2, it's key because it kind of allows Congress some additional powers. You know, we found that most of the powers of Congress are in Article 1, Section 8, although not quite exclusively. This is an addition to that. And this part has been used most recently to uphold acts of Congress, including the outlawing of hate crimes in 2009 and human trafficking. So Well, what is your take as a con law professor on the 13th Amendment?
Yeah, well, the 13th Amendment, I think you gave all the history quite well. It was an amendment that Abraham Lincoln himself, was very adamantly working towards ratification of. The other later, and in today's world, more significant Civil War amendments, the 14th and 15th. All the work on those were done after Lincoln was dead. But Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and as the war was moving to a close, he really started working the Congress to get the Constitution amended to end slavery. There were a few difficult aspects of doing that. Probably the most thorny problem around the 13th Amendment was that when we had slavery, the original Framers' Constitution had the 3/5 compromise. So slaves couldn't vote, but slaves were counted for purpose of both congressional representation and taxation, although they were only counted 3/5. So every 5 slaves counted as 3 people. And so that meant that when slavery was abolished and when the Confederate States rejoined the Union, they actually increased their representation in the U.S. Congress significantly. Yeah, by I guess you could say by 60%, right? Because if they went from 3/5 to 5/5, they added 2 more fifths out of 3.
The math is straightforward in this case.
Yes. So every southern state got to increase its population by a third. By 2/3. And
I was going to.
Yes. By 2/3. So that's very monumental shift in power in Congress, at least, and in the Electoral College towards the states that were just defeated. Now, this did kind of go hand in hand with, for one thing, not all those states wanted to ratify even the 13th Amendment, but they weren't allowed. Not only were they not allowed back in the Congress until they ratified that one, they actually weren't allowed back in the Congress till they also ratified the 14th Amendment. So in the immediate run of the 13th Amendment ratification, military reconstruction of the South continued. Confederate states didn't get seated in Congress again for a couple more years, but when they did get reseated in Congress, they had more power than ever. There had been, Section 2, which you talked about, that Congress's enumerated power. Congress did pass some legislation right after the enactment of the 13th Amendment, relying on it to deal with, the problems that were caused by the transition from slavery to freedom, really, and particularly the idea that a lot of African Americans in the South who'd been held as slaves, they actually didn't have homes or jobs or anything like that. They just lived in the slave cabins on their masters' plantations, and so freedom, brought suddenly, homelessness and poverty and things like that all of a sudden. And so the 13th Amendment, Section 2. Was used by Congress to enact what they called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a military-run program to try to help African Americans secure skills, secure some education, secure jobs, secure housing, and also initially to protect the African Americans in their ability to vote and even to run for office. And there were a handful of African Americans elected to Congress in the very earliest days when the southern states were readmitted, because the Army was still down there protecting those kind of rights. That didn't last long.
Well, on a bridge to the 14th Amendment there, I don't want to interrupt, but it is kind of part of this, was there were some thoughts originally during the drafting of the 14th Amendment that formerly enslaved persons should have a right to some of the property on which they had worked so that they would not be displaced persons. That doesn't end up happening. But that is something that some of the radical Republicans banter around with.
Yeah, that was, I think the sort of slogan around that was like 40 acres and a mule, right? That a freed slave should get 40 acres and a mule. And but that didn't actually happen. And sadly, after the Reconstruction ends in 1877, almost immediately, most of the African Americans who stay in the South are basically living in the same cabins that were their slave cabins on the same plantations where they used to be enslaved, and working as sharecroppers who are hardly paid anything and who have to, give their whole will pay back to their landlord to stay in the cabins. So, the 40 acres and a mule concept did not materialize that much, but it was definitely contemplated within the purview of the freedmen's bureaus. I guess the one other thing I would say about the 13th Amendment is that, after the end of Reconstruction, by and large, neither Congress nor the Supreme Court really relied on the 13th Amendment for much, because, it ends slavery. But once you don't have slavery, it doesn't have a lot of active uses anymore. And so I think but if people are curious, well, was it ever used for anything again after the 1870s? A couple kinds of contexts that it's been used in. The Justice Department in the 30s, when they first started a civil rights division in the Justice Department, the one they still have now, they would enforce sometimes against people who kept their servants in conditions of slavery. There was a famous successful prosecution in 1947 of a woman named Elizabeth Angles, who kept her domestic servant Dora Jones in conditions of slavery, and that prosecution was brought under the 13th Amendment. The other little bit of use that the 13th Amendment got in the 60s was in the 1960s, Congress occasionally did rely on the power in Section 2 to pass certain kinds of civil rights legislation that Congress said that we needed legislation that would ameliorate the badges and incidents of slavery. So the idea was that even though we hadn't had slavery for 100 years, we still have segregation, we still have discrimination, we still have maybe a lot of prejudice, and so the idea was that African Americans, even 100 years after the 13th Amendment, are still suffering from carrying the badges and incidents of slavery, and so Congress asserted the power under the 13th Amendment, Section 2, to pass civil rights legislation designed to ameliorate the badges and incidents of slavery. And one such statute that got enacted, which is still on the books, it's codified at 42 U.S. Code Section 1982, held that it's federal law. It's a predecessor of the Fair Housing Act, but it prohibited race discrimination in the sale of private property, and that was actually in a case called Jones versus Alfred H. Mayer. The Supreme Court held that was a valid use of Congress's 13th Amendment Section 2 power. So preventing race discrimination in the sales of real estate everywhere in the United States was legislation that was necessary and proper to eliminate the badges and incidents of slavery, and so in that sense was related to the 13th Amendment.
Well, Ken, I'm going to pause us right there because that brings us to the end of the ad-supported preview of the Supporters Midweek bonus show. So if you want to listen to the rest of this, and as I'd mentioned at the beginning, all of the other episodes that Ken and I have done on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and more, all you have to do is become a supporter of the Politics Guys by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. And even that first level of support right there is going to make you a supporter of the Politics Guys. And don't forget that if you become a yearly supporter, you get a discount on top of that. So again, head to patreon.com/politicsguys and unlock the rest of not just today's conversation on the 13th and 14th Amendment, but also with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution itself. There is a lot of content there, and I would love for you to join us. You'd also have the opportunity to join us talking about those issues as you're listening along on our Discord group. It's a lot of fun to be on there and to interact with our listeners there, and that's another one of our many benefits to becoming a supporter in addition to this show. Now, if you want to get the rest of this show, but for some reason there is a financial hardship involved, please just let us know. Reach out at mail@politicsguys.com. We'd love to make things right. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we'd really appreciate if you can subscribe, rate, or review on whatever podcast app you use and share those episodes on social media. You can see all those kind of information at the bottom down there on the show notes. If you've got any other kind of questions you'd like to share with any of us, please reach out at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And again, you'll find those links in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new full episode this weekend, and I hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,